Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is putting plans into practice. The year is 1912. Wilson is President-elect of the United States, and very few had reached that office with as little political experience or military experience than Woodrow Wilson. After all, he'd only been a governor for less than 2 years, but very few felt as prepared or as confident as Wilson, because in his mind, he had been preparing for this his entire life. His entire academic career was focused on government, political science. He's the nation's only PhD president, a true expert in the field, and he's ready to put those theories into practice as the nation's president. But first, the man was exhausted. He needed a break. He decided to take his wife, his family, off to Bermuda, one of his favorite vacation spots, spend a month there trying to relax and get ready for his new job. In the meantime, he had Colonel Edward House, the man he had met just about a year before, but had truly become a political intimate. He was in charge of vetting candidates for the cabinet, and he had total trust in House. According to Wilson, Mr. House is my second personality. He's my independent self. If I were in his place, I would do just as he suggested. If anyone thinks he is reflecting my opinion by whatever action he takes, they are welcome to the conclusion. One of the most interesting things about House is he didn't seem to want anything for himself. He didn't want a job for himself or his friends. He was just a free agent ready to do whatever Wilson wanted him to do. And over time, when Wilson became president, he was pretty much the second most powerful man in the country. Wilson had complete trust in him, including vetting the cabinet. Now, the first pick in the cabinet, William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State. Bryan 3 times had been the Democratic nominee for president. He never won, but he'd been really helpful to Wilson during the convention, during the campaign. Wilson felt he had earned the top spot in the cabinet, made that offer in late December, and Bryan accepted the position. House continued to vet candidates, came up with William McAdoo as Secretary of the Treasury. McAdoo also had been critical during the campaign. Then you've got Lindley Garrison as Secretary of War. He was really a suggestion of Joe Tumulty. Tumulty, also critical to Wilson. He had been his personal secretary as governor of New Jersey. He would continue in that role, very much like a chief of staff for Wilson throughout his 2 terms in office. Also in the cabinet, you had Albert Burleson, critical job as Postmaster General. Why was this so important? Patronage, all those jobs to go out, all those postmaster positions around the country that a lot of senators, congressmen cared about, Burleson was going to be in charge of that. Well, the sun was shining, not all that often, on March the 4th in Washington, D.C., but it was in 1913 when Wilson was ready to become the president. He met William Taft, the outgoing executive, at the White House. They traveled together to the Capitol, where Wilson was ready to give his inaugural address. Now, oratory had been the calling card for Woodrow Wilson throughout his entire adult life. This was the biggest speech of his life, and he opened it with a pretty bold statement. Hey, there's a new sheriff in town. As Wilson announced in his opening statement, there has been a change of government. He painted a vision whereby our duty is to cleanse, to reconsider, to restore, to correct the vile without impairing the good, to purify and humanize every process of our common life without weakening or sentimentalizing it. This is the high enterprise of the new day, to lift everything that concerns our life as a nation to the light that shines from the hearth fire of every man's conscience and vision of the right. A very visionary speech. It also got into specifics about the progressive agenda that Wilson wanted to pursue. Time to set up shop in the White House, which, by the way, Wilson had never even stepped foot in prior to becoming president. And this day, on his inauguration day, Wilson was not much of a social character, more of kind of a recluse. He really would surround himself with a small circle. His family, and this would continue in the presidency, his family, his wife, Ellen, his daughters, and really just 3 other really true intimates. Colonel House, Joe Tumulty, and a Navy captain by the name of Cary Grayson. Dr. Cary Grayson. Grayson had been the physician during the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft, and he hit it off with Wilson right away, both medically and personally. Wilson was never very well medically. He had these terribly pounding headaches. He had intestinal problems. Well, Grayson felt that Wilson was being over-medicated and actually reduced some of that medication, and that helped. He also thought that Wilson needed more exercise, more rest. He started giving these prescriptions, if you will, for Wilson, and they were working. He was feeling better. He liked having Grayson around. He would be a true intimate for the rest of Wilson's life. Wilson had a bold economic agenda that he was ready to hit right out of the gate, and he had a couple of areas in particular. The tariff, he wanted to bring that down, and he wanted to change the monetary structure of the country and bring some stability to the country from an economic standpoint. He also had a bold approach. Not since the nation's second president, John Adams, more than 100 years before, had any president addressed the U.S. Congress in person. Typically, they would send over reports or speeches that would be read by a clerk to the Congress. But a reporter suggested to Wilson, with all his oratorical skills, why doesn't he go to Congress himself and give these speeches? And he thought that was a good idea, worth trying. He had already called a special session of Congress to focus on the economic agenda right away. Didn't want to wait till the regular session in December, ready to go in the month of April of 1913, and he decided to go over to Congress and opened that session himself. He gave a 9-minute address, he made his case, and back in the car ride on the way back to the White House, he was kind of giggling, and his wife Ellen wanted to know why, and he was so sort of thrilled with his performance of making this speech at Congress, but there was one other thing in mind. He said, wouldn't Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt, wouldn't Teddy have been glad to think of that? I put one over on Teddy that time and am totally happy that competition between Roosevelt and Wilson was playing itself out. Now, in terms of the substance of this special session, it started with the tariff. The tariff is a touchy topic because it is such a sectional issue. You couldn't always count on your party to deliver legislation when it came to the tariff because the sectional divide sometimes would trump what the party was interested in. But Wilson was ready to roll up his sleeves and get to work. Remember, he really believed in the British parliamentary system of government, where the prime minister was very much part and parcel with the legislature. They would work very closely together, as opposed to in the United States, where it's typically more the separation of powers. But Wilson believed in that kind of system, and he got close with Oscar Underwood, the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, to come up with tariff legislation that they thought could pass. And then they really worked hard within the Democratic Party to get support. That was pretty straightforward in the House of Representatives. A little bit more difficult in the Senate, but they held the party together, and this was a major legislative accomplishment just a few months into Wilson's presidency. Tariff rates on average came down from about 40% down to about 25%, so a significant reduction. A number of items were added to the free list. Again, Wilson hitting a home run right out of the gate in his first legislative effort. But he wasn't done. The summer months continuing and hot and humid Washington, and there was number 2 on his economic agenda for this special session, and it had to do with sort of the monetary structure of the United States. Over the entire history of the country, there have been too many panics, too many recessions, where the history went where one bank or one financial house would sort of go under, and then they would all go down, kind of like a series of dominoes. And there was really nothing in place that the government could do to try to slow that down or correct the problem. And Wilson thought they had to make some structural changes. And so they came up with a series of ideas, one of which was around a dozen private regional banks. Now, these were not commercial banks for individual people to use, but these were the banks that the banks would use, and they would provide stability in each of these 12 regions. They could print money and be responsive to sort of supply and demand changes, maybe make it more elastic and agile. This entire system would then be overseen by a board, a Federal Reserve Board, which would be in charge of overseeing all this activity and also establishing policies, including interest rates on what the interest rates that banks would charge each other. So really trying to change the fundamental structure of how money was being managed in the economy in the United States. There was one group of folks who weren't in favor of this, and particularly to do with that board, and these are the bankers themselves, the existing bankers. They thought they were going to be losing too much power in the economy that they traditionally had it. So if they were going to support this system, they wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to be on that board, and Woodrow Wilson said basically no. This board was to work for the people, not for the banks, and he wanted people who would be independent. So the legislation they put forward for the Federal Reserve System would have this board. It would be nominated, its members nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, expected to work on behalf of the people, not on behalf of the banks. Once again, this was going to be challenging, particularly in the Senate. The House came along nicely, but the bankers really put the push on the Senate to try to change this legislation. But Wilson was able to hold the party together. The Democrats prevailed, and the Federal Reserve System was established on Woodrow Wilson's watch. This was most likely the most impactful reform of his entire 2 terms in office. Now, Wilson had some impact on the federal government, not always in the most positive way. One of the most negatives was in the area of civil rights, and a couple of his cabinet members were kind of pushing him into the decision that he made. McAdoo and Burleson at Treasury and the Postal Service, they were pushing to segregate their cabinet agencies, their entire departments, and Woodrow Wilson agreed with them. In this situation, blacks would be operating, they would still have jobs in the federal government, but they would be entirely separate units, physically separate from the white workers. They would work separately, they would eat separately, the bathrooms would be separate. And Woodrow Wilson, when he was pushed on this, thought this was going to be good for blacks. Why? Well, because they wouldn't have to compete with whites. In the old system, they would be limited in terms of their opportunity for growth, because in Wilson's mind, they couldn't compete effectively against whites. But if they're in their own units off to themselves, some would obtain positions of management, even though they were still very isolated in these black-only units. Again, there was pushback on this, but Wilson fully supported the measure. He said, in fact, the friction, or rather the discontent and uneasiness which had prevailed in many of the departments would thereby be removed. It is as far as possible from being a movement against the Negroes. I sincerely believe it to be in their interest. Well, tell you an example of how this played out in the Postal Service. Headquarters in Washington, D.C., after the segregation went into place, there were about 1,000 workers left in headquarters in Washington in the Postal Service. All of them except one were white. That one black was left, well, because he couldn't be moved. There was something about his job, it had to be done in headquarters. But even this person was isolated because they didn't feel the whites should have to look at this black worker under Burleson's watch. They surrounded him with screens, which to the blacks felt, frankly, like being put in a cage. The morale of blacks across government plummeted. There were loud complaints, including from one civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, the director of publicity and research at the NAACP at the time, and also the editor of the organization's monthly magazine, The Crisis. And he had supported Wilson in the campaign. No longer. Du Bois sent Wilson a letter. Not a single act and not a single word of yours since the election has given anyone reason to infer that you have the slightest interest in the colored people or desire to alleviate their intolerable position. The gravest attack on the liberties of our people since emancipation, public segregation of civil servants and government employee, necessarily involving personal insult and humiliation, has for the first time in history been made the policy of the United States government. Here is a plain, flat, disgraceful spitting in the face of people whose darkened countenances are already dark with the slime of insult. These are the words of Du Bois about the policies of Woodrow Wilson, the president, unmoved, his Southern tendencies firmly entrenched, his version of separate but equal and segregated departments in the federal government, just fine with President Woodrow Wilson, and that would persist. In terms of Wilson, again, his home life in the White House, largely a homebody, not a lot of large parties, except for those that were sort of required for the office. But Dr. Grayson continued to push Wilson to exercise. And where did he go? He went to the golf course. He played more golf in his tenure than any president in American history, more than 1,000 rounds of golf. He'd play 9 holes just about every day, usually in the mornings. He'd play 18 holes on weekends, didn't matter, rain, snow. They started painting his golf balls in the snow so he could find the ball. He was actually terrible at golf. He almost never broke 100, but didn't matter. It was his way to get away. He brought people along to play with him who wouldn't talk business. It was his exercise. It was his escape, frankly, to be on the golf course, and he would continue that rain or shine. There were a couple of party celebrations in the White House in the first couple of years of the Wilson administration, and they were weddings. 2 of his daughters got married in the White House. Now, his oldest daughter, Margaret, never got married, but Jessie, number 2, Francis Sayre became her husband in November of 1913, a rather large event at the White House. And then his youngest daughter, Nell, she got married, and this one was a little bit of a surprise and a little different. Her husband to be more than twice her age. She's 23, he's 50, he has 6 kids already from his first marriage, and he also happened to be the Secretary of the Treasury. William McAdoo had caught the eyes of Nell Wilson. And it might have been a little bit awkward, but in fact it was not. The Wilsons were happy to welcome William McAdoo into the family. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a very highly principled person, and the country was about to see how much in a particular area had to do with the Panama Canal, which was finally about to open on Wilson's watch. Congress, the term before, under Taft, had actually passed a law to exempt U.S. ships from paying tolls in the Panama Canal. And there were complaints about this, frankly, from around the world, especially from the British. Now, the British had given some relief to the Americans from a treaty that they had previously signed to allow the Americans to build the canal in the first place. But it was supposed to be on equal terms for all. And now that the Americans weren't going to have to pay for these tolls, that was unfair, and the British complained. So where did Wilson sit in all of this as the canal was about to open? He sided with the British. According to Wilson, he told Joe Tumulty, "I am the trustee of the people, and I am bound to take cognizance of the fact that by reason of our attitude on Panama tolls, our treaties are discredited in every chancellery of Europe. We may have made a very bad bargain with England on Panama on tolls, but it will be all the more credit to us if we stand by an agreement, even when it entails a sacrifice on our part." Wilson got Congress to make that change, and the American ships would pay the same tolls as everybody else. High praise for Wilson across the globe. That long-awaited canal finally opened on Wilson's watch, August 15th of 1914, when the Ancon, a U.S. ship, sailed through the locks. Well, again, Woodrow Wilson had studied for government service all his life. This was a good start for his domestic agenda. But remember, he had no experience at all in foreign affairs, and he was going to be tested on that right out of the gate. But that's the story for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson and putting plans into practice from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.